Can anybody at Trap University tell the class why we visit Mexico despite a travel advisory? What's a travel advisory? Kidnapping. Look how many times this is mentioned. This is called a federal travel advisory, advising you where you should and shouldn't travel. Now obviously if you go somewhere like most parts of Mexico City, Mexico is rather safe. In fact, there's a lot of Americans, primarily from Texas, that move to Mexico City. That's not where we go though. Every year I have to tell another relative, either my mom, a cousin, or an auntie, why I'm not interested in going on vacation to Mexico with them. Where is Tijuana? In Baja California. Separate from American California, primarily by the homicide rate. Fun fact, the name California most likely comes from a misconception. A poet named Garcia Rodriguez de Montalvo wrote a poem about Queen Calafia, the fictional queen of the island of California, which was also fictional, and 40 years later the Spanish discovered California, but since they didn't have satellites, they thought it was an island, and they said, hey look, it's just like the poem by that one guy, and then completely ignoring every name the indigenous people have for the area, they called it California. Anyway, in our California, 5 in every 100,000 people get murdered. In Baja, a state with over 30 million less people, 70 in every 100,000 people get murdered. I'm not the best at math, but this seems awful dangerous, and you'd honestly be better off in Stockton or South Central LA. You'd be more safe with Big U than you would in Baja California. Very beautiful though. Time for history. Ever since foreigners first discovered the beautiful land of the Mexica people, they just couldn't stay away. The first ever mestizo, or the people we know mainly today as Latinos and Latinas, was a guy named Martin, who was only born because his father loved Mexico so much that he cheated on his wife and had one of, if not the first interracial relationship on this side of the planet. If you want to call it a relationship, Malintzin, I think that's how you say it, was a Nahua woman who gave birth to Martin and was most likely just a servant of Hernan Cortez, since we all know the Spanish pretty much exploited the land in every way they could. Now, Hernan, the guy that led the conquest of Mexico, was actually told not to do exactly that. You see, the Spanish already had control over Cuba in his lifetime, and Cortez had been living in what's today the Dominican Republic since he was 18. And he eventually worked his way up to being a secretary of the Cuban governor, but he wanted to conquer Mexico, probably to get a reward from the Spanish crown back home, and Cortez was a very experienced administrator at the very least, so at this point he told Cortez to get his men and go secure inner Mexico, likely hoping that he'd be killed, but Diego suddenly had a change of heart, remembering that if Cortez didn't get killed, he would end up being seen as a hero or a great conqueror, conquistador, if he succeeded. So he told Cortez no, do not go to Mexico and do anything at all. And Cortez, likely looking for an opportunity to get rich, said, sure thing Diego, and he took 500 men, some boats, and some cannons and went straight to Mexico. Now good for him, when he arrived around Panama, he found a priest that had got shipwrecked and captured by the Maya people sometime earlier, and he ended up learning their language, so he was able to work as Cortez's translator. Cortez won some small battles and began converting the natives to Christianity. One of them he ended up getting pregnant, and this woman, who I mentioned earlier, helped him meet Emperor Moctezuma, although his native title was Tlatoani. Fun fact, the official residence for the presidents of Mexico, or Palacio Nacional, I probably butchered that, was built from the material of Moctezuma's palace, likely on the site of the original palace. Now, when Moctezuma and Cortez met in Veracruz, Cortez says that after they exchanged gifts, the emperor volunteered to be a subject of the Spanish crown. Not very believable though, since the Aztec society was very elitist, so obviously most people believe this was a lie. Either way, Moctezuma was confined to his palace, and he ended up doing something to make his people angry enough to throw stones at him, until he died. After this, we know the long history of oppression and subjugation of the Aztecs and all of Mexico, as well as Central and South America by the Spanish, as well as the near eradication by disease. Fast forward to the end of Spanish rule, and Texas deciding they didn't want to be Mexican anymore, despite the fact that Texas is basically Mexico south of Austin. I mean, look at this. What country would you think this was if I didn't show you the border? This is Texas, by the way. Anyway, in 2017, Mexico had its deadliest year on record. How many of your family members went to Mexico in 2017? Probably too many, especially if you're from somewhere like Arizona or something. Now, of course, there are many cartels, but the ones that hit closest to home are the Gulf Cartel, or Cartel del Golfo, which operate right on the other side of Laredo, Texas. But around 2020, they broke up into several groups, which is also not good. There's the Sinaloa, which of course in the US, some of time, their main customers were the Flores twins and Rudy Rangel, also known as King Cato of Chicago. All three were just some of the Americans that ran million-dollar operations sponsored by the great deals they would get from the Sinaloa. Although their deals ended up getting cut short when the Flores twins were arrested, also their wives, and Cato was murdered in a barbershop in Chicago. Although his wife didn't face any legal consequences, allegedly she was either the daughter or a close relative of some type of law enforcement in the city, and the Flores twins also ended up cooperating with the feds against the Sinaloa cartel. The Sinaloa were so influential at one point in Mexico that they had the Secretary of Public Security on the payroll. Doesn't sound very secure. And then of course there's the CJNG, the La Nueva Familia, and many more. But on to Americans in Mexico. Remember what I said about 2017? Now from January 2017 to December 2018, there are 18 pages of Americans that died, not Americans that were kidnapped and held for ransom. 18 pages of Americans that died in Mexico. I counted about 18 straight up homicides, and more than 30 of these deaths were just classified as other, which doesn't sound natural at all, and some of them were actually just classified as unknown. Now, this is an abnormal amount of death for foreign citizens in another country, with most of the murders taking place in Juarez or Tijuana, where Americans love to go for some reason. And a lot of the other accidents took place all over, such as Jalisco and Baja. Now, if you need me to tell you that Mexico is a very corrupt country, you must not understand what the word corruption means. Of course, as you all know, I'm from a city where corruption is so prevalent that our vice mayor was a bank robber, our state has the most corruption and bribery convictions of any elected officials in any other state, and our longest serving city official in history is currently in prison. Now, according to the Corruption Perception Index, which ranks countries based on corruption on a scale of 0 to 100, 100 being the least corrupt and 0 obviously being most corrupt, Mexico's rank is 26. Being more corrupt than Azerbaijan, a country that is widely perceived to have never had a fair election, Russia, a country that has only had 3 different presidents in 25 years, just 2 actually when you consider that one of them switched places with the other one while both ran the country at the exact same time, and more corrupt than Haiti, which doesn't even have a functioning government because when they did, they ended up giving power to gangs, and although it could be debated whether this is true or not, some gang leaders in Haiti right now claim they are still working on behalf of some government officials. But when it gets to the point where these cartels are organized billion-dollar corporations, law enforcement is weak and underpaid, money talks takes on a very literal meaning in the country. Until 2018, Mexico had a very controversial president. He and his wife spent $2 billion on publicity in 5 years, the largest publicity budget ever for a Mexican president, by the way. He was also accused of controlling several automated social media accounts to keep unfavorable news away from the public. The scandal was called Peña, and he also did something funny with his presidential campaign money, and the guy in charge of finding election-related crimes claimed the president's administration tried to bribe him. But when he didn't accept the money, he received a message saying, "Death follows you." Just in 2024, a former mayor, another woman who was running for mayor, a general coordinator for the police, and an indigenous activist were all assassinated in Mexico. From 2020 to 2023, an environmental activist was found dead in a reservoir, a congressman was shot dead in a car, a former governor was killed while having dinner in Jalisco, another congressman was handing out flyers when he was assassinated, a former politician that started a group to fight against the Knights Templar cartel in his town was ambushed in a vehicle before it was set on fire, and a federal deputy was also assassinated at a restaurant in Acapulco. The criminal organizations in this country are so powerful, it seems, that most politicians just don't see it as worth their life to try and go against them. There are some that do, and even some that manage to survive doing it. But the corruption and fear runs so deep that it's hard to say how anything can ever change. There is no doubt that probably the most unsuccessful war in history has been the war on drugs. Now, Mexico is no doubt one of the most beautiful nations on the planet, but the Americans that are usually on vacation here know nothing about politics in their own country, let alone international politics. More than half of Americans that visit probably don't even know Spanish. I can't tell you how many Americans I've encountered all around the country that second guess their answer when you ask which America we live in. Also, the other countries in the Americas think that we're kind of silly for referring to ourselves as American while pretending that no one else is, when this entire hemisphere of the world is known as the Americas, plural. Brazilians are South American. Hondurans are Central American. Canadians and Mexicans are North American. Mexico also contains 4 of the 5 oldest cities in North America. If it weren't for Mexicans, we would be in more of a skill shortage in the US than we already are. I know that some of the country boys in rural areas of the US are handy and have probably taken apart a 4-wheeler and put it back together several times, but the average guy living in a metro area, especially a high rent metro area like downtown Chicago or Manhattan, have no such skills. And I'm sorry to all of the Mexicans that are legally in the US that still face the same discrimination as those that came illegally. I remember my friend Nikki, who is from Dallas by the way, was confronted by his ex-girlfriend's dad, a dude from rural Indiana, and he insultingly asked Nikki if he could even speak English. Nikki, again, was born and raised in Texas and has spent more time in the Midwest than he ever did in Mexico, and likely only spoke Spanish as a second language. Now, if you've never been to Mexico City, I seriously encourage you to visit there before you just go to Tijuana and end up being held for ransom or something. It's a huge country if you just look at the map. And also, second guess your grandma if she ever shows you a janky looking resort package for a trip to Mexico. My mom actually just got scammed like this because apparently some people pretend to be travel agents and take advantage of senior citizens, but just book your own flight and your own hotel. And also look at the news. Thanks for watching.